through the Master on Public and Cultural Diplomacy. I guess that some of the students here come from that program, at least some of them. We also gather in the context of a research project, which is called Representing Religious Diversity in Europe, Past and Present and Features, which has been funded by the Italian Ministry of Research. We take the opportunity of having Professor Larson visiting Siena to engage in a discussion on culture, religious pluralism, and human rights, with a view, with a strong view of how to build peace through inclusion, tolerance, and mutual understanding, which is, of course, much needed in the present situation of multiple religious conflicts, of multiple ways in which religion is mobilized in exerting violence around the globe. As you can maybe guess from the title, Representing Religious Diversity, this project is a project which plays to two possible meanings of representing, and Daniele Ferrari would say more about this. For legal scholars, of course, representing is very much about public or private representation of wills and interests. So sort of political and then legal representation of rights. What we purport to do with what we actually are doing in this project is to involve social scientists and scientists from the humanities into broader discussion of representation, which would include cultural representation, even representation through the arts. And with a view of then having the two possible meanings of representation, so political and legal representation on the one hand, and cultural and liberal arts representation on the other, possibly merging into a complex, coherent, multifaceted apprehension of religion, where the scholarship on religion, scholarship of religious diversity can become a tool or a step into better politics on religion and better legal tools as well. So this being the background, the structure for our morning is the following. We will have Professor Ferrari, who's a colleague in the Rare Radio project, presenting the project actually. And then we will have two major papers, one by Federico Lenzerini, who's also a member of the research team. And Federico will talk about fostering cultural pluralism, inclusion, tolerance, and mutual understanding as tools for promoting reconciliation among religions. Then we'll have a short break and a second paper, a second presentation by Professor Herbert Larson from Tulane University on cultural heritage as a tool for religious reconciliation. And then, of course, it's not indicated in the program, but we will have plenty of space for discussion. So be aware from the beginning that you're very much welcome to contribute. And again, thank you very much for being here. Special thanks to Patrizia Vigni, a colleague and another member of the research team from Rare Radio. And again, to Professor Larson for taking the time to be with us and to share his research and thoughts on this topic. Now, before giving the floor to Daniele, maybe there's something which probably should be added in terms of the role of culture and investigation on culture as a crucial part of politics of religion and violence, and even religion and security. I think what we are doing is particularly valuable in two respects. The first one is a growing awareness that we need to move forward with our understanding of freedom of religion or belief, which traditionally was more an individual right based on choice. And of course, we still cherish this tradition. We still see this traditional religious freedom as an individual right based on free choice in matters of religion as a fantastic achievement, when, at least in terms of its incorporation in international law. But at the same time, we feel that in the international conversation, it's important to look at other aspects of religious freedom and to take into account different ways of articulation for the sake of a proper and more effective universalism of religious freedom per se. So this is one very big challenge, because as we move into looking at collective religious freedom and religious freedom more based on culture, of course, the risk is that the two aspects are, in fact, irreconcilable, that you either stand for religious freedom as a prominently individual right based on free choice to adhere or not to adhere or to change religion, or you look at freedom of religion as basically a collective right of institutions and organizations, or a freedom which is limited and fundamentally limited by allegiance to a culture, a community, and therefore based not on freedom, in fact, but on allegiance and based on culture as a fundamentally constraining element, impinging on the individual and on individual rights. And this is a fundamental tension which is there. And so in terms of international politics of freedom of religion or belief, as we're one month away from the next ministerial for the advancement of international freedom of religion or belief, which will be hosted in London at the beginning of July. This is a fundamental discussion. At the same time, of course, promotion of culture is, and this is the second side of the discussion, the promotion of culture and the protection of cultural rights is also emerging as something which cannot be left out of the conversation. And again, we need scholarship, we need engaging with this dimension as well. Now, I would say that people I would say experts, even activists in the domain of religious freedom, they much stronger on the traditional understanding of freedom of religion or belief. Well, possibly with some, organizational and collective protection added to the individual protection, but they're very much still lacking knowledge about how culture and cultural rights and culture of peoples can be brought into the conversation and can be protected. So this is how I see our conversation today as being extremely timely on the one hand and stimulating and promising on the other. So again, thank you everyone for this, and the floor to Daniele Ferrari for his presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Ventura. I'm really glad to be here. It's a really interesting opportunity to present our project. Today, I'm Daniele Ferrari. I'm a member of the legal staff of research in the University of Siena. And I propose you a presentation divided into two parts. The first part is devoted to the topic of the research, religious diversity as a area of research of our investigation. The second part is more focused on the legal part of our research in the relation between religious diversity and law. Concerning the topic of the research, religious diversity, the first step concerns the interdisciplinary approach. The second step, the second trajectory, describe the relation between text and context. And the last point is devoted to the challenges of the research concerning religious diversity. It's clear that religious diversity is at the same time the description of a historical process, of a legal process, and also of a linguistic process. Religious diversity is a linguistic formula useful to describe in interdisciplinary perspective different trajectory of construction in international European law, in the European historical tradition, but also in a linguistic perspective. For this reason, the research is composed by 3 units of investigation. The first one is the historical unit of research in the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. The second one is the legal unit in the University of Siena. And the last one is the linguistic unit in the National Council of Research. Religious diversity is a linguistic representation of the evolution of the idea of religion. If in the traditional meaning, religion was a criterion to describe identity, in particular national identity, religion with the race and the territory, it was a criterion to describe the idea of nation, the power of the nation, the identity of the nation, the identity of a community within the nation. With the evolution of social system, with the historical evolution, with the linguistic evolution, from also the legal evolution, religion as an element changed its meaning and became a really interesting driving factor to describe the relation between different actors in the same national context who profess different religions or beliefs. In this sense, religious diversity is a formula mobilized by the international and European institution, but mobilized also by the historical research and the linguistic research. And this idea to use religious diversity at the same time as a linguistic formula, but also as the crystallization of a legal, a historical, a linguistic process is the fil rouge, is the connection between the different units of research of our project. In this sense, also in the output of every unit of research, we can underline this connection, this synergy, this collaboration. For example, the historical unit of research will publish a historical dictionary of religious diversity. The legal unit within the University of Siena has developed a really complex research about the definition of the formula religious minority. Religious minority is the criterion in the legal perspective to investigate religious diversity in international European law, but also the linguistic unit use a computer program to measure, to evaluate the mobilization of the same linguistic formula in different holy texts, but also in different translation. There is this idea that this innovative approach can underline religious diversity in the interpretation of the holy text, in the mobilization of the same linguistic formula in different traditional religious contexts. And the challenges are linked to the theology. I think that religious diversity is a really useful category to underline a different interpretation of the same holy text. Religious diversity can work as a trigger to evaluate the debate, the dialectic relation within religious community, but also outside religious community concerning the interpretation, for example, of the Bible. We know that in this time in the Catholic Church, but also in the Christian arena, there is a really, really interesting debate about, for example, LGBT theology, about gender theology, about traditional theology. And religious diversity is a really useful category to study the relation and the confrontation and the conflict sometimes between these different points of view concerning the same text. Dialogue is another important point, the dialogue between different religious or non-religious actors, but also the dialogue between scholars and religious or non-religious actors is another dynamic where we can underline and produce a new awareness about religious diversity. And also intersectionality is really interesting, because normally when we describe religious diversity, the element of religion, the criterion of religion is really clear. The diversity is described in connection with religion. But in the complication, in the problematization of the human identity, it's true also that religion is always in connection with something different. For example, in the international legal debate, there is this really important point about the relation between women and religion, and the dimension of gender is an example of intersection between religion and gender, and a new perspective to investigate religious diversity, and a really interesting challenge, a really interesting match for our research. But also the interpretation of the formula freedom of religion or belief is a really useful laboratory to measure religious diversity in the international strategy. The idea to not define religion to produce a really inclusive protection from the freedom of religion or belief is another dimension where we can investigate religious diversity to verify if at the end religious diversity is another formula to describe freedom of religion or belief or not. Concerning the second part of my presentation is more or less the legal part of my presentation, of my introduction. The first point in our strategy is to define religious diversity. In legal terms, there isn't one definition or one official definition of religious diversity. And for this reason, the legal unit decided to use the notion of religious minority to investigate the notion of religious diversity. A religious minority is a really useful category to study a legal formula devoted to the protection of religious diversity, and to study the progressive construction of the category of religious minority. The research is divided into 3 steps. The first step is devoted to the construction, to the genesis, the historical genesis of the legal notion of religious minority in international law. The second step is more focused on the development of the notion of religious minority after the Second World War. And the last step is more linked to the transformation of the category of religious minority through the intersection with the protection of the right of other human community. Concerning the origin of the category of religious minority, the origin is after the First World War, when the changement of territory between the state producing the League of Nations the necessity to protect the right of a new religious community. And it's interesting because in this historical dynamic, the notion of religious minority changed the notion of the nation. For the first time, we have a nation where we can underline the existence of a different community concerning the religion, the language, or the race. And this is a really important element, and also a really important description of the shift of the meaning of religion from the traditional meaning of element of identity to a new meaning of diversity. In this sense, also in a historical perspective, religious minority is a really useful element, is a really useful dynamic to study and to research religious diversity. And there is also another element in the construction, in the legal institutional construction of a religious minority. The first element to elaborate, to qualify a group as a religious minority is the relation with the majority. The idea that the religious diversity is based on the relation between two different communities, a religious majority and a religious minority. And the relational element, in my point of view, is a really interesting criterion to investigate, to produce a reflection about religious diversity. After the Second World War, the religious minority and the religious minority rights were really problematic in the perspective of the United Nations, in this new idea of the foundation of universal human rights based on the dignity of the universal dimension of human being, this idea that human rights are protected not in function with the connection between the person and specific nation, but in connection with the relation between the person and the human being. The notion of religious minority was problematic. And for this reason, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1945, we haven't the notion of religious minority. There isn't the formula of the linguistic formula of religious minority in the Universal Declaration. But after that, the United Nations decided to include the religious minority rights in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights within the Article 27. And when the linguistic formula appear in the international text, appear also the problem to define religious minority, to elaborate a legal criterion to qualify a religious group or a group in general as a religious minority. For this reason, in 1979, Francesco Capotorti elaborated a study on the rights of persons belonging to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, and elaborated a specific criterion, a specific element to qualify a group as a religious minority. And it's interesting because in this definition of Capotorti, we can underline two dimensions of religious diversity. An internal dimension of religious diversity, a dimension of religious diversity within religious minority, and a dimension of religious diversity outside religious minority. The dimension of religious diversity within the religious minority is qualified by the relation between the members of the religious minority. In the description of Capotorti, the relation between the member of religious minority has to qualify by this sense of solidarity to preserve their religion. There is this idea that the solidarity has marked the relation between the members of the group. But there is also another element outside the religious minority, is the relation with the religious majority. And the idea that the religious minority is also in a non-dominant position. There is a hierarchy in the construction of Capotorti, in the religious system that Capotorti shaped by his definition. And I think that these two elements are really interesting to underline these two dimensions, these two trajectories of religious diversity. In 1985, Jules Deschênes, in another really interesting document, proposal concerning a definition of the term minority. Here, the linguistic approach is really clear in the legal approach. For Jules Deschênes, the definition of religious minority is a really problematic topic. Jules Deschênes said that religious minority is as a chameleon that changes color in function of the context. If I change the context of observation, the color of religious minority change. And for this reason, this problematization of the topic and also of the possibility to build a official, a legal definition of religious minority appear in the definition proposed by the expert. In this definition, there are a lot of elements, but there is always this idea of the internal and of the external dimension of the group. This idea of a non-dominant situation, this idea also of the will to survive of the group, and this idea of this element of solidarity, this element of to describe religious minority as a distinguishable group. The last step of the evolution of the topic is the transformation of the topic, is the transformation of the category of linguistic of religious minority. And here it's interesting to observe the possibility to underline the existence of religious diversity within religious diversity. In the same religious minority, we can observe a different kind of religious diversity expressed by, for example, LGBT people, member of religious minority. And in the perspective of the United Nations, this intersection between different elements of the identity in the context of religious minority is relevant, because for the United Nations, a person LGBT, a person who is at the same time LGBT and a member of religious minority, has a really important risk to become a victim of a discrimination. The criterion of discrimination, the principle of discrimination, became the criterion to elaborate the notion of religious minority in the direction to protect the right of a person who show a different kind of diversity within the religious minority. The other point of the development of our research is the education of religious diversity. In this context, in the University of Siena, we have organized specific classes devoted to religious diplomacy. Professor Ventura developed this course, Religious Diplomacy, concerning the relation between religious diversity and international, European, or national institution. And also another class is devoted to religion and diversity. In this case, religion diversity is developed by three different trajectories in religious minority, in migration, and in within LGBT rights. But we have also organized seminars and conferences in 2021 and 2022, and develop also social advocacy. This idea to promote a collaboration between religious actors, scholars, it's interesting to produce a new awareness, a new culture of religious diversity, but also to observe religious diversity as a dynamic process at the same time, a social process, but also an institutional process of dialogue. The last point is devoted to the literacy. In 2020, Marco Ventura published a really interesting article devoted to the formula freedom, religion, or belief in the laboratory of the European Union. And in 2021, I published a legal code concerning the religious minority rights to map in the international and European law the right of a religious minority, also in an intersectional perspective. I stop here. Thank you for your attention. A really good seminar for this day.
Thank you very much. We now move to Professor Larson. We've decided to shift on this.
Thank you. My name is Herbert Larson. I'm a professor, senior professor of practice at Tulane University in New Orleans. I am here as one of the directors of a program that Tulane University has had here in Siena. The program has existed here in Siena actually since the 1980s in partnership with the University of Siena, but it now exists and has existed in its present form since 2009. And it is a program in partnership with the University of Siena that is devoted to the protection of cultural property. And it has been a very successful program. It's one of the programs of which we are most proud at Tulane University, and I'm sure at the University of Siena. It has become probably the premier program in the world dedicated to the study of specifically the protection of cultural property, the international protection of that property. When Professor Lenzerini first asked me to talk about cultural property as a tool for religious reconciliation, I was a little taken aback because my personal background is I teach criminal law, and I'm actually also a criminal law practitioner, which in the United States is a little unusual, but not completely unusual in that I go to court and by and large represent people charged with a variety of crimes, everything from murder to theft to fraud in government programs. But I will say, however, that when it comes to issues regarding cultural property, I have always represented or worked on behalf of the government, on behalf of prosecution. In other words, I have worked for the protection of cultural property. And when I was thinking about what I could bring to you in terms of cultural property as a tool for religious reconciliation, I realized that one particular approach to understanding the potential for cultural property as such a tool is to first understand how cultural property is used as an instrument of destruction. That is to, in essence, understand the darker, more malign, potentially evil uses of cultural property. And if you look historically, and that is where criminal law intersects, obviously, with cultural property, and it's my particular interest in cultural property, because I look at essentially the uses of cultural property that are outside the law, that are illegal, as it were, that represent gross departures from accepted norms of human behavior. And if you can understand those, and if you can prevent those, and if you can take measures to curtail those types of behavior, you're halfway towards using cultural property for the positive purposes for which it's available, that is, as a tool for reconciliation. And so I will start very, very briefly with the idea that historically, cultural property, and I'll get into sort of definitions of cultural property, but if you think of cultural property just in terms of tangible objects, cultural property historically has fallen into two categories when it comes to criminal behavior. The first is that it represents what we would call loot. And that is, these were the spoils of war. And the efforts to curtail human behavior with regard to using these, and someone once described the Crusades as a series of great shopping trips to the Middle East by Europeans, which is reasonably accurate. But if you look at the efforts of humanity to curtail this type of behavior, they began only very recently. In fact, the first codal implementation of any type of effort to curtail the use of spoils of war as loot came in 1863 with the advent of the Libra Code in the United States. Significantly, the Libra Code, you can trace the genealogy of the Libra Code through the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions, and you can trace the Hague Conventions almost directly to the Rome Statute, specifically Article 8 of the Rome Statute, which essentially prohibits looting. And that, of course, prohibits the looting of cultural property from religious institutions, of course. The other significant use of cultural property has been its outright destruction. And by outright destruction, I am talking about, if you want to eradicate a culture, if you want to eradicate a religion, you destroy the cultural property of that culture, you destroy the cultural property of that religion. This is why right now you see it happening in Ukraine. You have seen it happen repeatedly in the Middle East. You have seen it happen in World War II. We saw it happen in World War I. The Napoleonic Wars, you go back and back. And if you want to destroy a culture, if you want to eliminate a culture, you destroy its cultural property. So this might be a good time to talk about, well, what do I mean by cultural property? And as a lawyer, I typically would divide cultural property into two broad categories: tangible and intangible cultural property. And I would say that the destruction of intangible cultural property is the harder to categorize, because you are destroying things like oral traditions. Any diaspora of people is going to destroy the oral traditions of that culture. You are destroying essentially a way of living. We see it with indigenous peoples everywhere, that the dispersion of those indigenous peoples results in the destruction of something intangible, yet very, very real. But what we tend to focus on, and what the law is perhaps best at protecting, is acting against the destruction of tangible cultural property. And that's what, frankly, most of our current laws are based on. And so if we think about tangible cultural property, and by and large, I'm going to confine my remarks to tangible cultural property, what do we see and what do we experience when we think about, well, what does cultural property represent? In the sense of, when we talk about cultural property, and we think of tangible objects, what are we really experiencing as human beings? And so, sort of as an exercise in anticipation of talking to you today, I went and looked at the top 25 tourist attractions in the world. And they were not surprising in one sense. Number one was the Eiffel Tower, clearly cultural property. It's a symbol of all that is Paris, all that is France. The Colosseum in Rome was number two. The Statue of Liberty in New York was number three. Machu Picchu in Peru was number four, and the Acropolis in Athens was number five. And I thought, well, none of those are religious in nature. They are all clearly cultural property, but what do they represent to us as human beings? And then I kept reading on the list, and I came to Angkor Wat, Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres, also in France, the Hagia Sophia, and the Sistine Chapel. All of them religious in nature. Now, when those objects were created, and you stop and think about it, none of them were created with the idea that they would become cultural icons. The people who were creating them were not driven by the notion that, oh, I'm building for posterity. It might have crossed their minds, but I don't think Eiffel, when he was constructing and designing the Eiffel Tower, actually it was meant to be taken down shortly after the exposition in Paris. When we create objects, and particularly I'm thinking of the Pinacoteca here, when you go through it and you look at the religious iconography that exists there and the beautiful art, when we stop and think about, well, what was it that was created and why were these things created? These people were obviously motivated by at least two things, particularly when you get to religious works of cultural property. The first was they were motivated by their religions, that these are objects that have tremendous religious significance to the people creating them. They are fraught with symbolism, they tell stories, they communicate to the people of their time. Why do we revere them now? We revere them now not because we can go there and not be moved by religion to go see them. I would say probably most of the people who go to the Pinacoteca may not be deeply religious or religious at all, or they may be of a different religion. We go to appreciate them first as objects of beauty because they represent tremendous skill. They are beautiful in their own right. But why else do we look at them? Why else do we go to them? Why do we become tourists? And particularly, why do we become tourists of religious artifacts? In the sense that, why do we go to the Hagia Sophia? Why do we go to the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel? Why do we visit these places? For these reasons. And I would suggest that the answer lies in sort of the nature of human beings. And human beings are clearly extremely complex creatures driven by conflicting desires and motives. And these things manifest themselves in cultural property. The first is that we all assemble into tribes, into groups, because we find protection in groups, we find comfort in groups. It's unfortunately one of the reasons that underlies the divisiveness that now exists in the United States. We have separated ourselves into red camps and blue camps, and we surround ourselves with people who reflect our own beliefs, our own ideas, and we live in essentially what people refer to as an echo chamber. We're constantly hearing our own opinions voiced back to us, and they reflect what we already believe, so we take comfort in that fact. But then there is that side of human nature that is curious. It's the side that leads scientists to continually explore. It's the side that leads lawyers and scholars to continually push the boundaries of knowledge. And it is the side of us, I think, that takes us as human beings to want to learn about other cultures and other religions. And that is what takes me to the Pinacoteca. That is what takes me to the Hagia Sophia. That is what takes me to Notre Dame. That's what takes me to Chartres or Angkor Wat. And I've been to all of those places. And in each one, I had a glimpse and a sense not only of timelessness, because these are objects that are speaking to me across time, but I had a sense of transcendence. And that is what I think infuses truly cultural property in religion. That there is inherent in religious cultural property a notion that there are powers outside of human beings that operate upon our lives, that exist in our lives, that we must come to terms with, that are relevant to us. And if we can understand how other cultures have created objects that embody those ideas and that embody those emotions, that in one sense represent the inherent duality, as it were, of human beings, both the fear and the desire and the curiosity to go beyond the fear, then we have the opportunity to truly understand the other cultures. And it is, as I said, the opposite of the dark side of the destruction of cultural property. And so this is all a roundabout way of saying that this is why the preservation of cultural property and the preservation of the cultural property of other religions is of such importance. Because unless we preserve it, we don't have it to study and we don't have it to understand. And if we don't have it to understand, we can't begin building the bridges to the other cultures. Because what the works in the Pinacoteca represent to me now are certainly not what they represented to the people who created them. But if I can understand and catch a glimpse of why those people created them, what they were thinking and what they were feeling at the time that they did, I have built a bridge to that time, to that place, and to that people. And since the people who now still treat them as religious iconography are the descendants, both intellectual and emotional, of the people who created them, I've created bridges to those people. It's like two people appreciating the same object automatically have something in common. You automatically have a bond. you can strike up the communication, you can begin the conversation. And that is why it is so important, and it's why it's so important to me today. In one of his plays, Shakespeare wrote the line, "Speak that I may know you." And the idea was, when I hear how you talk, how you speak, what you say, the vocabulary you choose, I know who you are. And I would say that the cultural property parallel to that would be create that I may know you. Because if I can see and understand that which you have created in the religious context, I can begin to understand you without you saying a word, without you having the opportunity to say a word. And so this, if you're students here, we have frequently invited students to come sit in on our classes at different times. All you have to do would be to approach me or Professor Lenzerini. I know as students, frequently the last thing you want is more classes. I've taught long enough to know that. But please talk to me, because this is important. It's important to everyone, not just those of us who work in this field. So with that, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very inspiring and stimulating. I would suggest we take some questions now, reactions, remarks. The mic is here.
Thank you, Professor Larson. As Marco Ventura just said, your lecture was very inspiring. And I think that there are several points in common between your and my presentation. But I'm not sure that I will be able to convey the same message in such an inspiring way. So thank you very much. Yes, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the importance of understanding the intention which is behind the destruction of cultural property or cultural heritage, which in my opinion is a crucial point. And this is reflected in the context of the international law as well, when it comes to the prosecution of people responsible of destruction of cultural heritage or cultural property. And I think that this aspect is very close to another point that you raised, which is the fact that cultural heritage is composed by both tangible and intangible. And of course, I totally agree with this assumption. And I would say that most elements of cultural heritage or cultural property have both a tangible and an intangible side, an intangible dimension. And this reflects what you were saying about religious heritage. Religious heritage, especially some of the examples that you mentioned, but of course there are many others, no? Instills in us a feeling of admiration, a feeling of beauty, but at the same time is especially important for the people who reflect themselves in those buildings as essential element of their religion, which in turn is a fundamental part of their cultural identity and of their life. And these two elements, tangible and intangible, are to be considered together when it comes exactly to the destruction of cultural heritage, because on the one hand, perpetrators destroy a physical building, but on the other hand, what they want to hit is the special attachment of people those buildings. We can think about, for instance, the destruction of mosques in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992 and 1993. And it's interesting that international courts have developed a very, in my opinion, positive approach towards this kind of situations, which unfortunately I was quite disappointed when I read the judgment in the Almaty case by the International Criminal Court, because the International Criminal Court does not follow the same path, which is to consider, now we're talking about technical issues in terms of international criminal law, which is to consider destruction of cultural property not only as a war crime as it is qualified by relevant international instruments, but as a crime against humanity as well, because there is a discriminatory intent behind this kind of action, which is gives rise to the crime of persecution that is actually a crime against humanity. And also both the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Court of Justice have considered that when there is systematic destruction of cultural property, which is accompanied by also physical destruction, this act can be considered as evidence to show the criminal intent of genocide, which, as you know, is very, very difficult to demonstrate, because the relevant international definition requires the specific intent. And so you had to enter into the mind of the perpetrator and to read this mind to demonstrate that there was exactly the intention of committing genocide. And since the attachment between cultural heritage and its creators and bureaus is so intense, destruction of heritage can actually serve to demonstrate the existence of this intent. So there has been at the international level a very interesting evolution in the interpretation of destruction of cultural property. Unfortunately, I don't know very well the context of domestic law, and especially American law. So probably, do you think that same kind of approach can be found also in American courts, for instance, in the practice and the jurisprudence of American courts when dealing with cultural heritage? Are they used to consider this spiritual aspect of heritage when there are situations? I don't think that in the United States that there are many instances of destruction of cultural property.
There are.
Where we see it in the United States is not in terms of prosecutions necessarily for the destruction of cultural property per se, but in the context of what we refer to as hate crimes. The classic examples are people painting swastikas on synagogues. And those would not be, while that is the destruction of cultural property, and it is certainly the intentional destruction of cultural property, it is not prosecuted as that per se. They move it into the category of a hate crime, which frankly prosecutors find easier to prove. In the United States, sad to say, we have a very unsophisticated approach to the prosecution of cultural property crimes. It is not a priority for most prosecutors. The most district attorneys, those of you who may or may not be familiar with the American system, we have federal prosecutors who prosecute crimes over which there is jurisdiction in the federal courts. They prosecute maybe 5% of all crimes prosecuted in the United States. They're generally reserved for major prosecutions, major drug prosecutions, major fraud prosecutions. So most crimes are prosecuted by local district attorneys. Those district attorneys are by and large elected officials. They are political officials. Probably not a good idea, but it's what we have in the United States. As political officials, they create hierarchies of prosecutions. And I can promise you that cultural property crimes are pretty near the bottom of those hierarchies. So when they come across a crime like a hate crime, they will take the easy route and not prosecute it as specifically persecution of a religious group or something of that nature. So courts, in state courts, would not ever get into a sophisticated analysis of the motives necessarily. They would simply have that type of prosecution as a hate crime. And the other thing that cuts against the development of a sophisticated jurisprudence in the United States in this area is that 97% of all cases in the United States are resolved through plea bargains. No factual findings need be made. The defendant simply appears. There has been a negotiation as to what the charges will be and what the sentence will be, and the defendant will plead guilty, and the judge just moves on to the next case. So to answer your question, unfortunately, no, there will not. I am not aware of any sophisticated or even thoughtful analysis of the relationship between intentional conduct and whether this constitutes persecution or whether you can look to something besides that.
Well, but I'm very much satisfied by your answer, because if these crimes are considered as hate crimes, the emphasis is on the spiritual aspect, no, of the crime.
Yeah.
So more or less, there is a parallelism between the American and the international approach.
There would be that parallel, except and I see your point where you're looking to the hate of the group towards the group, and that the destruction of their cultural property is simply a manifestation of that hatred. So in that sense, but I would be very, very surprised if there were any state court judgments that made that type of analysis. So.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Ventura because it involves us in the very stimulating events. And secondly, I would like to thank Professor Lenzerini for having organized this specific event and for having involved me as well. And then my question is for you, actually, and I want to I want to join a part of the argument of Professor Lenzerini. Actually, maybe I am a bit provocative from this point of view, but I believe that in both cases that you mentioned about the illegal use of cultural property, we can infer a sort of appreciation of cultural property, because if you steal it, during the looting, it means that you attribute a value to those properties. Similarly, when you destroy these objects, as Professor Lenzerini has highlighted, you recognize the importance of this object for that specific group, and you want to carry out an hostile conduct against that group. So you are going to destroy something that is very important for that group. And so this is a sort of a recognition of the importance of this object. But what I think that even at the international level, in particular when there are international missions towards foreign countries, we experience a different approach with respect to cultural property, which is the fact that there is not interest and there is not consideration of this cultural heritage. And so sometimes cultural heritage is destroyed, not because there is the intention to harm someone else, but just because we think that that is not important enough. And this is a sort of, I think this may be a link with what Daniela said before about the concept of, and the terminology of the concept of minorities. Because in the terminology itself, there is, in my view, the original sin. The fact that you consider something minor. And it's not just a problem of the number of the participants, the number of the members of a group. It's the fact that you consider that is something less. This is the etymological origin of the word. And similarly, I believe, is also the term diversity. Because the term diversity is a term that etymologically means to go or to use a different way with respect to the right one. So I think that sometimes what is more dangerous for the protection of cultural heritage is the fact that cultural heritage is not considered relevant, and relevant for its emotional value, no matter if it's a religious or human value, but for its emotional value. And conversely, just to consider that these things are not relevant, and so we can destroy it for most important purposes. So that's why I'm quite critical with respect to military necessity sometimes in this regard. I don't know if you were mentioning this in the field of, as to the courts, as to the approach of some courts to consider these more properties than cultural objects.
Well, I would agree that implicit in the destruction of cultural property or the looting of cultural property, implicit in that is a recognition of the importance of that property to that culture, which is precisely why you would loot it or destroy it, because of these are symbols sort of laden with value and meaning to that culture. The other type of problem that you talk about is in essence almost a type of cultural imperialism. And we see examples of that still in modern times. I mean, the classic example in the United States is our treatment of indigenous peoples, American Indian tribes, that we did not appreciate their culture, and we basically, the best way to describe it quite bluntly is it was genocide by the white settlers, European settlers, as they moved forward west, taking the lands, relocating the peoples, all of which would be considered crimes against humanity now, and rightfully so, relocating them to reservations, forbidding the use of their languages, destroying their traditions, their everything about the people. And we still have an incredible number of misguided policies towards the indigenous peoples of the United States. And it represents just a sense that our culture was superior to their culture, and only probably in the last 50 years have we begun to recognize in the United States the beauty, the value, the depth, the complexity, and the just the humanity of the cultures that we nearly eradicated, and have begun to take steps to preserve both the tangible and the intangible cultural property, including some of the languages. There is a wonderful example. During World War II, to communicate by radio without fear of being basically intercepted in the United States and overheard, they used people who spoke Navajo. And obviously no one except Native Americans understood the Navajo language, and so they could speak freely without fear of having their communications intercepted. And to this day, we see, the headdresses, the Native rituals, the entire culture is just now beginning to be preserved with the Native American NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in the United States. We're just now beginning to take those steps. So, but it is a danger as we move culturally, and it's unfortunately time and time again, we think that because we are perhaps more technologically advanced, that somehow we are more culturally advanced when we move into areas, and it's particularly egregious when it comes to exploitation of resources, minerals, timber, and other things, diamonds, and even now antiquities. One of my colleagues, Teresa Davis, coined the term blood antiquities, which I think was like the blood diamonds, which I think is an accurate description.
If I may just a very little point, because what Professor Vigni just said made me reflect. Indeed, I would call that cultural heritage paradox. No? If you think, as an example, the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan in 2001, I don't think that the Taliban did not appreciate the beauty of such heritage. Yes, and even the value. I think that you say the really right thing, because those people were thinking, okay, these are very important for others, in that occasion for the international community as a whole, because the Buddhas of Bamiyan did not reflect any existing religion or any existing culture. They're not important for us, for our culture and our religion, but they're even more important at the general level. I don't know whether I am able to explain myself. This comes to my mind a poem which is very well known in Italy, the 5th of May by Alessandro Manzoni, talking about Napoleon. And in this poem, Manzoni tries to explain the reason why Napoleon was exiled in St. Helena, the island of St. Helena. And I remember because in secondary school, I liked that poem very much, so I still have many verses in my mind. I remember one verse when the author explains this paradox of the approach of the other countries towards Napoleon, the kind of appreciation that they had towards him, that was great envy and profound pity at the same time, inextinguishable hatred and great love at the same time. I think that this is very similar to what people who destroy cultural heritage feel, and this is very close to what you said in the end. And I think that the more you perceive the beauty of an element of cultural heritage, the more you are motivated to destroy it, because you understand that it is particularly important. And of course, it is not important for you, but it becomes important for you because it gives you the opportunity, yes, to do something that it is particularly significant for what you want to achieve. So this is paradoxical in the end.
That's why it's very useful to demonstrate the criminal intent and the fact that there is an international crime. Conversely, in the other case, when you destroy the more imperialistic approach, as Professor Larson said, in that case, it's more difficult to demonstrate the criminal intent.
It's almost a gross, what we would call gross negligence.
Well, although in the case of the Italians, that's pre-Islamic art.
Yes.
That's the period of ignorance. That's idolatry. That's so it's really an alternative. Well, if there's beauty to it, it's the beauty of the demon. It's the beauty of the day. So there's I'll qualify.
Yeah,
the appreciation of beauty argument.
Everything for them was idolatry.
But it's ignorance. There's an Arabic term for that.
And
it's pre-Islamic. So if and the figure, especially the human figure, is problematic insofar as it verges into the divine. So representing the divine with the human figure, in certain Islamic cultures is blasphemous. So yeah.
And we go back to what Professor Larson said about knowing each other.
Yeah, but that's about knowing in a sense and expressing a basic rejection and condemnation of what the other's religion stands for, precisely because it's idolatry. So iconoclasty in that regard can be built on a very refined interpretation or representation, to stick to our keyword, representing. So, well, of course, but when the indigenous land, so that is, in my eyes, much closer to just denial, just being blind to what can be sacred for another culture. It's not a church. It's not a religious symbol, it's not a cross or a crucifix, it's the land. Or even something, there's in last year bestseller by Franz and Crossroads, the indigenous land as a special part in the novel. And at some point, this Mennonite pastor is confronted while visiting the Mesa of the Navajo, is confronted with an holy spot, so he's told, you don't go there because it's an holy piece of land. And he asks, why is it so? Because someone has been struck dead by the lightning there. And this makes that spot. Well, in that case, then there's in the novel, it triggers the process of enlightenment by the man of the past, because he gets awareness of the diversity of God, manifestations of God. But in the first place, as a Christian, you don't recognize that spot as sacred at all, because it doesn't fit into how you categorize the sacred. And the sacred in the space, and the sacred in the property and in the tangible. So that would be very much an example of just being blind to something which is of value for the others. Which is, I think, why the indigenous sort of issue is getting so relevant today. That's really about the other, right?
If we can try to, because no, there should be people watching us on YouTube, so that they may not understand what we say.
So I just want to reconnect to what Professor Ventura just said about indigenous people having this special contact with land and probably our culture, like in this case, Christian culture. We don't understand that for them maybe a river or piece of land can be sacred, but also it's part from our culture as well. I will say, not only as Christians, like as Western cultures coming from not the Christianity itself, but let's say pre-Christianity civilization. Like I will quote one that is much more closer to the Italian one, like the Nuragic one. They have very deep connections, for example, with land, like with the rocks, for example. Like in Sardinia, we have very connection with the rocks. For example, we think there are some rocks are magic because they're very ancient land. So this can also be, I think, also ignorance, for example, like do not understand what is important from different people, different cultures, but also maybe can also be, that's a question for whoever would like to answer, can also become from some kind of like, I will say, maybe different Christianity groups. For example, maybe the ones probably living in US, like not like the difference between Catholics and others, just maybe that developed later. So with different kind of knowledge of what is important from some people, others. So that's what I think, because I mean, like if I will see in Europe, we have this kind of connection, maybe with also similar can be with indigenous people, because we were indigenous once as well. So yeah.
No, well, land rights of indigenous peoples is my subject.
That's right.
But I don't have much to say concerning the arguments you have raised. I think you are all right. We have to say that when it comes to indigenous people's lands, there is also, which goes a little bit outside the topic of our discussion, there is also a strong economic aspect to be considered, because of course indigenous lands, indigenous traditional lands are untouched, and they have been untouched for centuries, and they should remain as such, because as you were saying, they're sacred. The land is the Mama Pacha, no? the motherland, and so it cannot be touched. It's something within which the community lives. And this is conceived in a very strong intergenerational dimension. The problem is that when you recognize indigenous people's land rights as a government, you must accept that you cannot touch those lands, which may be very rich of mineral resources or biological resources, and there are huge interests by the governments to exploit those lands, especially in Latin America. What we are seeing in these days is that officially the governments recognize land rights of indigenous peoples. By the way, I'm referring to Latin American because It is the only region of the world in which the majority of states have ratified the ILO Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples in independent countries. So they have a real international obligation arising from a treaty, because the status of customary international law is quite controversial at the moment. But that treaty is very clear. And so officially they have to respect the lands of indigenous people. But at the same time, you have mysterious deaths of indigenous leaders. You have mysterious happenings because they want to persuade them to abandon their land because they're very rich of resources. So it's a huge problem, which connects, of course, with cultural property or cultural heritage, because for indigenous peoples, everything is cultural heritage, especially the land, as Professor Ventura was saying. The land is the first element of cultural heritage, because they have a very holistic understanding of life and heritage, which basically coincide with each other in the end. No?
I totally see the difference between the Protestant and the culture. Of course, it's also different time history. It's already modern European history. And for early Christianity, Eastern and Western, I would see that as a sort of partly incorporation of the previous rituals and engagement with nature and elements of nature. So it's been partly incorporated and somehow reinvented through different cults, including saints, which are strongly associated with elements of nature, and while at the same time drawing a line, and beyond that line, it's just magics. It's just magic to be opposed, and because it's not incorporated. So there's, yeah. Yeah. Now it's Now it's difficult to say. Well, I'll be tempted. I'm not an historian of religion, but I'll be tempted really to see it as a sort of more of a clash of power rather than anything inherent. Because what was possible to incorporate through the action of a saint, and when was then Christianized, that was absolutely acceptable. Whereas the same elements left out for some reason, because possibly the rituals were performed by people who were not incorporated in the church, would see themselves as still sort of an alternative to the church, would be condemned and repressed. So I would, but as a legal expert, I probably put too much of a weight on the power structure of the struggle, but it's difficult, really difficult for me, and still today. Well, southern Italy, well, you mentioned Sardinia, southern Italy especially. But you think of Siena and the association of the horse in the church and whatever. I mean, those are clearly incorporations from previous rituals and sacredness into acceptable forms of Christianity. And now, of course, we live in a different time when you think of that in completely new terms, vis-a-vis environment and conservation. I think that the theme of conservation is very interesting, because if you think of religious conservatism, you not necessarily, well, you don't associate it. We were not used to associate religious conservatism to conservation of culture, property, and the environment at all. Well, quite the contrary, right? Quite the contrary. Well, I think the US would be a great example. The evangelical right in favor of heavy exploitation in Alaska, for instance. Okay, it's the exact opposite to leftist Christians fighting for the environment, right? So this is an interesting, very new conversation in my eyes, where the conservation of the environment represent a completely different challenge today.
The incorporation is very common. So you see in many countries that they have objects in the church which reflected the beliefs of pre-Christianic people, pre-Christianic religion, and it's very interesting because you see this hybrid in the sense, but which is very very nice to see and very also appreciable under a cultural point of view. No? And I think that this is a demonstration, and this is a way to achieve what we are talking about today, reconciliation among religions. No? Because if you accept that your religion can be blended with examples of different beliefs, it means that in the end there is a convergence between what I believe and what you believe. And there is an appreciation as well, as Professor Larson was saying, no? That is important because we start from beauty and then we understand the other, which is the real way to achieve reconciliation.
I can do it later, no? It's just a small reflection connected to... no, okay, it's fine. Yeah, I just would like to say something very simple. I will try to be very as clear as possible, but I really liked your inspirational intervention, so for that I will try to say something, and I try to connect to what the professor was saying, and also the previous intervention from Professor Ferrari. So I would like to start to say, to start from the questions that you did. That you said, like, does what cultural property represent for human beings? And another point that I found very interesting, and it is simple, but I found it very interesting, the concept of creation, because the creation of cultural property. But creation is a process of creativity. And so for this, it's something that creates, that gives uniqueness to the things of human beings. And so this process of creation, the creativity that permits communication and transcendence, so among generations. And this unites and links human beings. So this is why I love to go in Turkey and visit Hagia Sophia, or I'd like to go in France and visit Notre Dame, because I love the beauty that transcends religion and other things. And this curiosity to visit and to know the other created in history, I think, a process of contamination and richness among cultures. And I like to link this to diversity, to the concept of diversity. So what is diversity actually? And what is identity? So, I mean, actually, for me, it's a kind of nice reflection that I would like to connect with Professor Ferrari's intervention and the importance of interdisciplinary approaches and how to see things and terms from different perspectives. So to give a kind of different significance that can create positive solutions for reconciliation, for example. So I hope it was clear what I was saying. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I have a little reaction to the really interesting observation of Patrizia Vigni. In your understanding, the notion of diversity is problematic, can be problematic. The word. Yeah.
Centuries ago, it's like to say that while verto means go to wars, verto means move to another direction.
Yeah.
It seems that it implies that there is a right direction and a wrong direction.
But I think that it's probably it's really important the context parce que, because I think it's true that diversity can represent a idea of hierarchy, of normality, of a model and diversity. But I think that diversity is a solution to clarify a relation between different religious groups, between different linguistic groups. Religious diversity exists. Is a really pragmatic element that we can observe in the reality. And it's true that international institutions, in a lot of cases, yeah, but it's true that religious diversity is normally mobilized by international and European institutions to qualify the violation of human rights. There is this idea of vulnerable groups behind this formula, religious diversity. And it's also that plurality is normally mobilized when there aren't problem of violation. I observe a lot of documents devoted to religious persecution, for example. Yeah.
Using words that sometimes have a negative connotation without maybe without the intent.
Yeah. No. But I agree with your point. It's true that diversity, when I use the category of diversity with students, there are a lot of students tell me it's not a good category because there is behind the idea of normalization, the idea of. But it's true also that normally I think that the idea of diversity in legal context, in legal dialogue, is normally mobilized in connection with this idea of violence on violation of human rights. But it's a really interesting problematization, I think, also in the etymological perspective, in the genesis of a linguistic category in Latin or in other language, or in translation also from English, from Italian to other language.
So small short break, and we resume at noon.
Lo posso spegnere.
Okay, so welcome again to those of you who are still present. I think that in the first part of our meeting, we had a very interesting discussion. And this discussion was very comprehensive, and it covered most of the topic that we had the intention to develop during this workshop, including my own topics. So I will try to be very brief, and then I don't know if there will be time for further discussion. The line of argument that I wanted to develop is not dissimilar from the one developed by Professor Larson, especially trying to emphasize the importance of knowing each other and trying to understand the value of diversity and different people and communities. I wanted to start with two quotes coming from very different contexts. And we were talking about indigenous peoples, and my first quote is one pronounced by Black Elk, who was living between the 19th and the 20th century. He was a spiritual leader of the Oglala Sioux, a Native American tribe. And in this quote, he talks about the true peace. He says that there are three different kinds of peace. The first peace, which is the most important, and now I'm quoting, is that which comes within the souls of people when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all its powers, and when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells the Great Spirit, and that the center is really everywhere. It is within each of us. This is the real peace, and the others are but reflections of this. The second peace is that which is made between two individuals, and the third is that which is made between two nations. But above all, you should understand that there can never be peace between nations until there is known that true peace is within the souls of men. The second quote is a very famous one because it is taken from the UNESCO Constitution, which was adopted in 1945. And it is taken exactly from the first two sentences of the preamble of the UNESCO Constitution. The most famous part is the one according to which, since words begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. That ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause throughout the history of mankind, of that suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world, through which their differences have all too often broken into war. We can note that these two quotes are very similar with each other. No? The substance is the same, in my opinion. There is maybe a difference in the level of spirituality inspiring each of these two sentences, because the one of Black Elk refers to the soul, and this is consistent with the idea of life of indigenous peoples. The other refers to the mind, which is more pragmatical. But they both emphasize the fact that we have to work on the inner part of the human being in order to achieve peace eventually, and religious reconciliation, which is part of this peace. And it is paradoxical that these two quotes came more or less at the same time from two words which were opposite with each other, because on the one hand you had the indigenous word, on the other hand you had UNESCO, which, and I don't want to express any negative judgment, of course, on UNESCO. I find it a very positive institution. But UNESCO was an emanation of the so-called civilized world, which at the relevant time, as Professor Larson was emphasized, had not the interest of indigenous peoples at the top of its conscience, no? On the contrary, this civilized world was trying to annihilate, in a way or another, the identity of indigenous people, sometimes through simply absorbing them within the dominant society, in other occasions even with creeping genocide, for sure cultural genocide, if not physical genocide. So we can see that in reality, humanity, even if we take two different sides, two sides of humanity which are at the opposite with each other, 2 worlds apart, I would say, in reality, all humanity shares the same feeling as regards the recipe for peace and mutual understanding. The title of my presentation was concentrating on how it is possible to achieve reconciliation among religions through cultural pluralism, inclusion, tolerance, and mutual understanding, which are all difficult concepts under many perspectives. I wanted to touch cultural diversity as well, and we have been talking about the danger which is inherent in this expression. Of course, international law has tried to value the positive side of cultural diversity as a good which may help human beings to find good relations between them. And cultural diversity is linked to the enjoyment of human rights, is linked to cultural pluralism, and is linked to the other elements, to the other concepts that I mentioned, tolerance and mutual understanding. Even tolerance is a very dangerous word, because tolerance can be understood in different ways. It is not very well known, but there is a specific UNESCO Declaration on Tolerance, which was adopted in 1995. And so the articles of this declaration are devoted to tolerance. But if we look at the etymological meaning of tolerance, and I have tried to find the meaning in the Oxford English Dictionary, we can see that tolerance means the ability or willingness to tolerate the existence of opinions or behavior that one dislikes or disagrees with. And this is a negative meaning, no? That we give to tolerance. It has very negative implications because it can lead to paternalism, lack of intercultural empathy, unresponsiveness, and disrespect. I mean, I impose myself to respect the others, but I don't really think that the others are worth respecting. This is the reason why this declaration tries to give tolerance a different meaning. There is a long definition of tolerance, which means respect, acceptance, and appreciation of the rich diversity of our world's cultures, our forms of expression, and ways of being human. Tolerance is defined as the virtue that makes peace possible and contributes to the replacement of the culture of war by a culture of peace. Tolerance is not concession, it's not condensation or indulgence. Tolerance is above all an active attitude promoted by recognition of the universal human rights and fundamental freedoms of others. It is the responsibility that upholds human rights, pluralism, including religious pluralism, democracy, and the rule of law. It involves the rejection of dogmatism and absolutism and affirms the standards set out in international human rights instruments. Tolerance is crucial in terms of reconciliation among religions because it's the first step that we should try to achieve when it comes to the difficult way of understanding the others. Then there is inclusion. Inclusion is another difficult concept because inclusion among religions involves proper understanding of religious pluralism, trying to appreciate at the same time the common features existing in the beliefs and languages spoken by most religions, and the value and beauty of differences. So this is the way to which cultural diversity is to be conceived, as an element of beauty. Article 1 of the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, which was adopted in 2001, expresses the principle according to which cultural diversity is as necessary for humanity as biodiversity for nature. So it is a value which must be appreciated and valorized. Inclusion, and this brings me back to one of the arguments raised by Professor Larson. You were talking about the sense of transcendence, no? When we go to visit a religious place. This is something that I had defined as the capacity to perceive spirituality in religious places which represent religions that are not ours. For instance, I was lucky because once in my life I was visiting Iran, and in Esfahan there is a very beautiful mosque. And when I was alone in the big square in which the mosque was located, and I heard the voice of the muezzin, I really perceived the spirituality, even though that was not my religion. And the same happened to me in Nepal when I heard the singing of the priests, of the monks, which is a religion totally different from mine, but the spirituality was tangible, really tangible in that occasion. And I think it is the same concept that you were explaining to us, no? When talking about the sense of transcendence. And this is a formidable way, in my opinion, to reconcile among religions, because you understand that what you perceive is also perceived by the faithful of other religions. Inclusion is very much linked with religious pluralism, which means interaction of religious sectors with one another and with the society and the state around concrete cultural, social, economic, and political agendas. It denotes a politics that joins diverse communities with overlapping but distinctive ethics and ways of manifesting their own beliefs. And it is crucial that the civil society, with the right intentions, learns how to engage with faith for more inclusion. Inclusion presupposes mutual respect, the need of avoiding stereotypes and bias, and openness to understanding. The next step is mutual understanding, which is probably the most difficult step, because we had just said that tolerance, I can impose tolerance to myself, even though in my mind I have thoughts that are totally different and are not perceivable by external people, but what is important is what exists within the walls of my mind. So I can show the others that I'm tolerant, even when I'm not. But when it comes to mutual understanding, this only exists when there is a genuine feeling of empathy, a genuine feeling of sympathy for people who are considered different and for religions who are considered different. Mutual understanding requires the development of exactly a genuine feeling of empathy towards others. And only through mutual understanding it is possible to remove the intolerance and the prejudice for other religions that too many people cultivate within their minds. Mutual understanding requires a long and difficult exercise of self-education. So prior than educations of the others, one has to educate oneself. And this self-education should be aimed at removing the stereotypes that too often are instilled in our mind by the society and all the people who influence our beliefs and our thoughts. This is the theory, I would say, which is quite easy to tell because we only have to express principles that are very beautiful, but sometimes are very difficult to put into practice. What is the way to follow? I would like to use another quote. I like quotes very much. This comes from a musician, a cellist, an American cellist called Yo-Yo Ma, who is quite famous, especially in the United States. No? Once he said, "We love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. We must learn about other cultures in order to understand, in order to love, and in order to preserve our common world heritage." So basically, the way should be knowledge and education to achieve this knowledge and to promote understanding among religions. And this is translated into international instruments in the end. So we're coming to the legal aspect a little bit. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, at paragraph 2, states that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. According to the relevant international instruments, what are the decisive steps to be achieved in this respect? First of all, education to human rights. It is important to understand human rights, and especially my students know what we mean about universality of human rights, because we have discussed a lot in class about this concept and all the paradoxes linked to this concept. But universality for sure exists in terms of entitlement to human rights, in terms of the existence of an equal right by all human beings to enjoy their human rights. And this is crucial. The understanding of this aspect is crucial because we should keep in our mind the idea that, okay, I have entitled to certain prerogatives, but also any other human being in the world is entitled exactly to the same prerogatives. And the effective enjoyment of my rights stops exactly at the point when the enjoyment of the rights of the others start. Then there is the need to develop specific educational policies and programs for promoting tolerance and mutual understanding. And this is emphasized especially by the Declaration of Principle of Tolerance. Rational tolerance teaching methods must be developed to address the cultural, social, economic, political, and religious sources of intolerance, major roots of violence and exclusion, and to develop understanding, solidarity, and tolerance among individuals, as well as among ethnic, social, cultural, religious, and linguistic groups and nations. There is the role, which is a very important role, of the media. We have another instrument adopted by UNESCO, which is also not very well known, that properly and specifically addresses the role of the media in promoting an ideal of peace. It was adopted in 1978, and I'm smiling because the name is longer than probably the totality of the articles of the Declaration. The name is Declaration on Fundamental Principles Concerning the Contribution of the Mass Media to Strengthening Peace and International Understanding, to the Promotion of Human Rights, and to counter racialism, apartheid, and incitement to war. Article 1 stresses that the strengthening of peace and international understanding, the promotion of human rights, and the countering of racialism, apartheid, and incitement to war demands a free flow and a wider and better balanced dissemination of information. To this end, the mass media have a leading contribution to make. His contribution will be the more effective to the extent that the information reflects the different aspects of the subject dealt with. But another very important aspect is to allow people to develop their own ability to reason with their own mind. We know that in most cases, religious intolerance is determined by the influence that is instilled by certain people over others, especially we know about certain schools, no, in some countries of the world, taking children since a very early age. And when we wonder why or how is it possible for a person, for instance, to consider that it is right to make himself blow in a public place, killing many people. I mean, we wonder how a person can think that this is a right approach. But we should consider that probably since their very birth, since their very first years of their life, they have been educated that that is the only solution, that is the only way, that is the only right thing in their life. So it will be important to comply with the imperative necessity of developing the ability of people to reason with their own mind, of considering different points of view, of understanding the value of different points of view. And this is perceived by the UNESCO Declaration of Principle of Tolerance, which asserts that in order to counter influences that lead to fear and exclusion of others, education for tolerance should help people to develop capacities for independent judgment, critical thinking, and ethical reasoning. Finally, when it comes to education to religion, the points that are especially emphasized by the relevant instruments are the need to remove all misunderstandings, which are often maintained exactly for the purpose of instilling hatred. So we should understand that all religions are instruments of peace, despite the different interpretations that some people try to attribute to certain religions. We should understand that all religions teach against violence and call for peace, foster inclusion and respect, also for the followers of different religions. We are too often unable to see that religions are sources of values that nourish an ethics of cultural pluralism, promoting solidarity and equal respect. And this connects again to the presentation by Professor Larson. Spiritual heritage is capable to provide humanity with the capacity for personal and social transformation and mutual understanding. So I'm coming to my conclusion, and again, I will use a quote. A quote by the 19th century explorer Sir Richard Burton, who wrote that all fate is false, all fate is true. Truth is the shattered mirror strewn in myriad bits. While each believes his little bit amounting to the whole, amounting to the whole truth, this is not the reality. I mean, with these words, he wanted to say that we can find parts of the truth everywhere, and we will not find the whole truth anywhere. Unfortunately, when it comes to relationships among religions, the mistake of many people today is to consider their own little bit as the deposit of the whole truth. Or that is equivalent, that the truth must be conceived according to one's own perspective, and any other perspective is not valid because it sees the truth in a different way. So basically, this is the most difficult part, because these beautiful words have been pronounced many times by philosophers and religious leaders and legal instruments, and we know very, very well what is the current situation of our world. But what we should do would be to develop a mental openness in order to understand that the whole of the truth may only be found through blending together the different members of the human family, and more specifically, the different religions with each other. I promise to be short. I hope that I kept my promise. Thank you. I think this question could be the starting point for the next workshop. Because we will have much to discuss. My students know that we discuss this issue is, I would say, a transversal issue of all our discussions. No? Of course, contextualized in the field of human rights.
Universalism as well.
Universalism, or to what extent we should allow cultural differences in shaping the practical contents of human rights and so on. The problem comes, in my opinion, when, which happens very frequently, law interacts with ideological or moral issues. Because sometimes there is no way to provide an objective legal answer to certain moral topics, moral issues. For instance, we have studied the case of the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights concerning the moment of the beginning of life, no? Because according to Article 2 of the Convention, anyone is entitled to the right to life. Who is this anyone? When does anyone start to be one included in the concept of anyone? And the European Court of Human Rights was unable to provide an answer to the question, when does life start? And so it applied the theory of the margin of appreciation, saying that each state is free to decide when life starts, of course, within the limits determined by conception and birth. No? And I promise that when I will find a student in my class that will be able to give an objective answer to this question and to these kinds of questions, I will give him or her my position of professor of human rights in this university, because this person would definitely deserve this position more than me. And I have written a book and several articles on this issue, but I have never found a solution. I think that law should be tolerant the way that the cultural specificity of the society allows it to be tolerant, which is to be defined on a case-by-case basis. Another case which was very much controversial, if you remember, that we have also discussed in class, I think it was a judgment by the Corte di Cassazione, Court of Cassation, in 2017, if I'm not wrong, is the one concerning the ritual knife of the Sikh, no? The Indian religion, that they have 5 sacred objects that they always need to wear. One is the turban, another is the knife. And our Court of Cassation gave an answer to whether they should be allowed to wear this knife, saying that no, because this is contrary to a general idea of public order and public safety. And there was a very unfortunate sentence pronounced by the Corte di Cassazione in that case, because the court said, in the end, if a foreigner comes to Italy, has to adapt to the cultural models prevailing in this country. Probably they could say, they could pronounce this principle with a different formulation, I would say. But it's difficult to find a solution, because in other countries of the world, Sikhs are allowed to wear the knife. For instance, in most of the American states, in the United Kingdom, according to my knowledge, in Canada as well. We can say that there is a different view of public order, because when it comes to weapons, to arms, in Italy we have one of the most restrictive legislations in the world. So this position by the Corte di Cassazione can be considered consistent with the general Italian approach with regard to the possibility of wearing weapons in public places. But it's difficult to find a solution, and each time there are so many different implications that influence the decision of a lawmaker. So personally, I am unable to give an objective answer to your question. You could avoid to say that.
And the fact was that actually I started a case in one state, and was the case in the United Kingdom of civil policemen that wanted to have urban instead of the government. In that case, they won they had the right to
And in class, we studied the case of the Canadian Railways. Now, remember, the case of a Sikh who wanted to wear the turban and not the hard gear that was mandatory for all people working for the railway. And he refused. And in that case, he lost the case, because the Human Rights Committee in that particular case found that it was legitimate for the government of Canada to impose to wear the hard gear irrespective of the religious convictions of the applicant. So with respect to really similar cases, we can see opposite solutions around the world.
I would say one thing is the argument, and another thing is the political pressure.
But for us, for international lawyers, because that's used for the case very existent of some
A human rights court should not be influenced by political pressure. Should.
Again, should or should not be something. I wouldn't limit the perspective to just social or political pressure. We shouldn't. That is very effective when it comes to, I would say, whatever social or political.
No.
Religions in particular.
We know very well that the European Court of Human Rights is very much influenced by non-legal pressure.
The pressure comes differently, and of course,
No.
Supranational influence play out differently, but I think this is a general factor that we, as legal scholars,
Yes.
without, of course, taking this as
No,
reason for not that into arguments, of course, because, but then the two, that doesn't need to play between arguments. Again, if you think of the Christian right and why they were so effective at some point with international litigation.
Yes, especially in the...
Depending on the ability in formulating that. So, well, the two come together. Right?
Especially in the field of religion, we have a case law by the European Court of Human Rights, which is quite disappointing because in most cases they apply the margin of appreciation, which means a state can do what it wants, basically. We had crucial cases concerning, for instance, the presence of the crucifix in public schools, concerning whether or not a student is allowed to wear a headscarf at the university. And in all these cases, basically, the court has said, you can do what you want. It's up to the state to decide, which solves the problem, but is a paradox, as I always say, because human rights have the primary purpose of defending the person against the state. So the state is the perpetrator. And in that way, you put the decision in the hands of the perpetrator. Tell me if you have violated the law, if you have infringed human rights. Of course, I have not.
Well, so many things.
Oh, yes.
Especially about this convergence of religions and the two factors behind this. Well, you mainly identify human rights as a sort of, as the vector, as I see it. You also mentioned resources from within religions. And anyway, both converging in the direction of, I call it super religion. That can be called in many different ways. But of course, then you have, well, my hypothesis is that because of this trend, because of this movement towards convergence of religions, joint mobilization of religions, you also have an opposite movement triggered by this one. So the response to this movement, which is about emphasizing identities, emphasizing distinctiveness, emphasizing the wrongness, or relativizing, for the sake of the global conversation. So this side should also be taken into account. Now, I share, of course, the global argument, and, well, where the argument is normally, that's fixed already. But if you want to be more descriptive, this should be able to help with this kind of setback, with this kind of reaction, this kind of response, especially from the religious world, can be very helpful.
Okay, so thank you very much to everybody for participating. I think that we developed a very interesting discussion, and especially thanks to Professor Larson for his presence, to Professor Marco Ventura, Professor Patrizia Vigni, Daniele Ferrari, and to the students who also gave a very important contribution to our discussion. Thanks to everybody.